Among all the extraordinary variety of edged weapons, swords occupy a special place. Sword is not just a weapon. In medieval Europe it is also a status symbol. What was a sword? In fact, the sword is a weapon with a straight double-edged blade suitable for both chopping and stabbing blow. The sword's center of gravity is shifted closer to the guard, which on the one hand reduced the force of a chopping blow, but on the other hand gave better controllability. For example, the saber's center of gravity is shifted further away from the crossguard, so with the same mass as the sword, the saber delivers a more powerful chopping blow, but it feels heavier and is less controllable. The X's center of gravity is at the opposite end of the hilt, therefore, the X's blow is more powerful, but you can defense with an X. Using the rule of leverage, we can understand that with equal mass of cold weapons, shifting the center of gravity to the guard increases controllability, but weakens the force of impact. Many people do not believe that most swords weighed no more than 1 to 1.5 kilograms, but it should be understood that the sword is first and foremost a weapon of quick and accurate strikes, often on complex trajectories. Although on the battlefield was not always time for feints, so often used straight and fast blows. In fact, when making swords, blacksmiths on the contrary were looking for solutions to make them lighter and stronger. One of such solutions was the formation of a trough and stiffening ribs on the blade. Some people call it a trough for blood, but in reality it is called a chute and is used to lighten the blade without loss of strength. However, to make a light weapon with a thin and narrow blade for a long time, no one has sought, and the reason for this is not the level of development of blacksmithing. The point is that in addition to the type of damage caused by cold weapons has a stopping effect. For example, a poke with a knife in the middle of a fight. The injured person may not even notice, although after some time this damage can lead to death. At the same time, a blow with a club to the head or ribs may leave only a bump or bruise, but has a much greater stopping effect. On the battlefield, it was not enough to inflict a wound that would eventually kill the enemy. It was necessary to inflict blows that would have a stopping effect and prevent counterattacks. For this purpose, either the weapon had to have a certain mass allowing to transmit significant impulse at impact, or to inflict extensive wounds, or to keep the wounded enemy at a distance due to the long shaft. In general, small in area but deep stab wounds are very terrible, but in the heat of battle chopped wounds due to the momentum and area of damage have a greater stopping effect. But time passed, and in the 13th to 14th century there is an active development of cities. The city from a large village turns not only into a center of craft and trade, but also into the center of social life. Noble knights became nobles and began to move to the cities. In addition, a stratum of the urban population, though ignorant, but very wealthy, is formed. The city is not a battlefield, but the character and people are different, and quarrels arose often. In addition, and there were always enough people who liked to get rich at other people's expense. Obviously, a knight or a wealthy citizen needs a weapon of self-defense. A banal knife or dagger was not suitable for this role. In open spaces, a long blade gave undeniable advantages, but it is worth remembering that weapons for self-defense should be fast and maneuverable. Thus in the cities of Spain in the second half of the 15th century appears espada ropera well, or something that literally translates, sword for the suit. That is, not for armor, but for clothing. In most European languages the second part of this word combination has migrated, rapier. It is important to note that the rapier is not a direct evolution of the classical sword, and in a number of classifications brought in a separate type of weapon. Roughly speaking, it is a branch of the sword, which, due to certain circumstances, was further developed. A series of articles say that the sword becomes thinner and, by the 15th century, turns into a rapier, then from the battlefield comes to civilian life, but here everything is not so unambiguous. Let us open the most authoritative typology of European swords oakshot, look at the swords that were used up to the 16th century and were covals of the rapier. We see that the resemblance is very questionable. According to many researchers, the use of the rapier against armor or as a means of striking at unprotected areas of the body, developed protection of the hand is one of the distinctive features of the rapier. Thanks to the developed guard, there is no need to wear lath gloves. For a knight wearing armor and gauntlets, this design is more of a hindrance than an additional protection. Lot armor as well as classical swords were actively used more than a century after the appearance of rapier. It is also important to remember that there was a stabbing weapon, which in the Middle Ages was used on the battlefield, including against opponents in armor. However, it was not a rapier, and the source and conjure. The widespread use of this weapon did not have. In the historical chronicle it is mentioned from the 12th century. The birthplace of the rapier is not a battlefield, but a city, although later fate will throw some varieties of this weapon and on the battlefields. However, it is worth to stop here and understand what the rapier actually is. In fact, it is a long-bladed weapon with a developed guard and the center of gravity shifted to the hilt. Despite the fact that the blade itself was very narrow, for a long time it was double-edged. However, shifting the center of gravity to the hilt gave better control, but reduced the effectiveness of the chopping blow. Against an opponent in armor, such a blow was almost useless. The rapier in the form in which it is presented by the majority did not appear at once. It was preceded by swords with ricasso rings for the grip called overguard. The presence of these rings again unambiguously hints that these swords were used without special separate means of protection of the hand itself. Grip gave better controllability of the blade. On the battlefield, especially in cavalry combat, this grip did not give a strong advantage, but was very useful in a duel. Although there is an opinion that this transitional version could have been used by artillerymen, their hands and arms, because of the nature of their work, had no protective equipment. Many people mistakenly believe that the rapier was much lighter than the sword, but it is not quite so. Both weapons had approximately equal mass from 1 to 1.5 kilograms. However, the rapier was somewhat longer. Total length could well reach 130 centimeters and more. That is, the dimensions were similar to a sword and a half. However, it should be remembered that a large part of the mass came to the tip, apple and hilt, so despite the different mass and decent length in the hand of this weapon felt lighter than a classic sword. Wounds from a thin blade did not always stop the opponent quickly, but in a duel there was a possibility to retreat, parry in general to stall until the wounded opponent lost strength. On the battlefield this weapon comes already at the turn of the 16th-18th century, that is, in the new time. Despite the fact that by this time the full battle dress armor is already disappearing, the military rapier acquires a more massive form. A striking example of this is the Pappenheimer, whose mass could reach 1,700 grams, that is, was close to some not the most weighty two-handed swords. However, it was no longer a mass and the main means of combat. Mainly rapiers were in the armament of officers. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, swords and rapiers cohabit and fulfill different functions. Swords were used on battlefields, and rapiers in cities as weapons of self-defense. At the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century, the sword gradually disappears. Radical changes occur in military affairs. An important role is played by firearms. Infantry in most cases is reduced to detachments of musketeers. The main weapon to there was, as is easy to understand, musket, and pennants, armed with long pikes. Cavalry, for the most part, favored swords and sabers. Sword and rapier are like a sports car and an SUV, a rifle and a pistol. That is, objects of the same type, but different purposes and different scenarios of use. So, to say that a sword or rapier is better is wrong, nor can it be said that the rapier was superior to the sword and supplanted it. It just happened to be more relevant in the new realities. Thanks for your attention. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment to promote the video.